Hello, my name is Neil Shelley, and today I'm going to show you how to repair the new Blendtec Designer Series or model CTB1. Now, the model comes in multiple colors on this model housing, so regardless of the color, the repair process is the same. So to start with, let's talk about some of the tools you're going to need. You're going to need a 3/8 Allen wrench or a 9mm, a pair of needle nose pliers, a socket wrench with a 7/16 socket, a hammer, and if you'd like, you can have a flat screwdriver or just a pointed tool like this one. And it doesn't hurt to have a screwdriver with interchangeable bits just to be on the safe side. So to begin with, we want to make sure we have a cloth or some paper towels to set the machine upside down on so we don't scratch that top housing. Now, on the bottom of the machine, we have these 4 holes, and that's how we're going to gain access to the motor. So I'm going to actually use this power driver just to make it faster. Now, with those screws loosened, what we'll do is we'll take the base plate off, and the screws should stay in, and you'll want to keep the assembly like that so you don't lose the screws. Now, inside the machine we have this baffle, and this is a hard, rigid baffle, and it will just lift out. It's not secured with anything, and we'll set that aside as well. Now, with those parts removed, we can look inside the machine. We can see the electronic assembly, we can see the motor assembly, and the power cord. Now, the Designer Series is capacitive touch. There's no power switch, a traditional power switch, not a rocker, so it's always on. So when you do this, make sure it's unplugged. Now, the next step, we're going to take these 2 little screws down in here out, and that's going to remove the middle housing. Okay. With those loosened, we can just lift the middle housing, and the power cord just slides right out, and we'll set that aside. Now, you want to use a lot of caution with the middle housing. They can scratch fairly easy, and so just use some caution there. Now, in order to do the repairs on this blender, what we need to understand is we have a gasket covering the electronic board. Now, this is not secured, so you can just gently lift it off. And again, set it aside. If you need to, if it's been damaged or if it's dirty, you can replace that. Okay? Now, any repair that we need to do to this machine is going to require you to get to at least this point. If the board needs to be replaced, the motor has to come out. The board does not have to come out in order for the motor to be replaced. Now, these motors are a modular unit. It can come out as a whole, and we can supply those as a service part, or you can rebuild the motor itself. And we're going to tear it all apart today, so you'll see all of it. There are 4, let me turn this around for you. There's 4 screws that hold the motor to the top housing. All right, so we're going to need to loosen those. You're going to need a long bit for this, a longer, at least 4 inches worth of bit. So we're going to take those out. But first, we're going to disconnect all the wire connectors. Now, these are all just press-on connectors. You can easily pull them off, other than this one connector here. This is your thermal sensor. It's just a 2-pin connector. You just pull it off. Very simple. Okay. These others, you're going to want to grab some wire, brace against the motor, and just pull them up. Okay, now, as with all the Blendtec motors, the 2 wires coming off of the motor itself are non-polar, so you can hook these up in either location and it will be fine. Okay, we'll disconnect the earth, and then we have all the power cord wires. So we have the earth, the neutral, and the line. So all of those just get pulled off, and now your cord assembly is loose. Okay? So all you have now are the wires that are attached to the motor. Okay? So we're going to loosen up these 4 screws. So those are now loose, and you can actually pull those out of the assembly. The biggest challenge on the Designer Series is that there is a speed sensor mounted to the armature. We call it a magnet disc, and you won't necessarily be able to see it right now, but it needs to be aligned in a certain way in order for the motor assembly to come out. And once I've got it out, I'll show you. Because right now the motor housing is being retained by the sling ring. And as with all of our other equipment, this is a pressed on piece. Easiest way to get it out is with the Allen wrench and just hit it on the countertop. So I'm just going to put some protective plastic down. I'm going to just make sure that that magnet disc is aligned the way I want it. We're going to pop this in there. Now you can also do this with a hammer. In this method, placing it here and tapping it gently with a hammer. This tends to be a little faster and is more the method that I'm used to. So you hold the motor assembly, make sure that's aligned, and just... Okay, so now that I've popped that off, the sling ring will be retained on the Allen wrench. Okay, I can set the top housing with the electronic assembly aside, and I have the motor assembly free. Now that we've got the motor assembly free, you can see the magnet disc I was talking about here. Now this part needs to be aligned with the arms of the die-cast bracket in order to pop it out. Otherwise, if it's turned this way, one of these magnets will catch the board and damage it. All right? So you want to make sure that you've got this aligned in that manner when you pop it out. And you can see that from the back of the machine. So first I'm going to set this one aside, and we're going to look at the electronic assembly. The electronic assembly is retained to the top housing with 3 little screws, 2 here and 1 here. Now, this is a smaller size Phillips. It's a number 1 or a number 0, and you'll want to use a smaller bit, and for this I like to use a hand screwdriver because it's a lower chance of stripping out the threads in the housing. So we're just going to take those out real easy. I like these ratcheting screwdrivers because they're a little easier to use. So we're just going to loosen those up. And I'll get you familiar with the board. Now the board, just like all Blendtec electronic components, is non-serviceable. There's no components on here that you can replace or change. If the board is bad, you replace the entire board. Okay. So we take that off. It goes over these retaining pins. Comes off real easy. Now, if you're taking this off, you're going to want to use some caution. The LEDs here on the bottom are very fragile, and they can break off easily, so you want to be very, very careful with those. All right, so I'm going to keep the screws in the electronic board, and I'm going to set the board aside for now. We'll just set that off to one side. Now the top housing, all it has is we have our diffusers, which is just channeling the light for the capacitive touch, and the label. Now neither of these are likely to fail or need to be replaced. If they do, you let us know. We'll send you the parts. All right. Let's take a look at the motor. Now, if you've been repairing Blendtec motors, this is going to be very familiar to you. It's going to be very simple to repair. I'm going to show you how we take it apart. Again, you're going to need the Allen wrench. It goes into the socket. And then we just use our socket wrench to take off the nut that's retaining the fan. And use caution around the fan blade itself because it's not terribly sharp, but you can still cut yourself. So once you've got that nut going, just use the Allen wrench to loosen it up. So there's our nut. And then we have the washer, which just comes off. And then we have the fan. Now the easiest way to get the fan off for me is to very carefully brace it with your fingers and then use the fan to twist it off. However, that's not necessarily the safest method. So another alternative is to use a pair of needle nose pliers and hold it on a very slight angle. You don't want to deform the fan if you're going to reuse it, and you can just gently lift it off. Under the fan, we'll have our fan spacer, and again, that just comes off, very easy. It might be difficult to pick out, but there is a definite top to the fan where it flares out. Okay, so where it doesn't flare is the bottom. Set that aside. We have 2 screws holding the motor together. Just take your screwdriver. Now that the bracket's loosened, I can pull the field and the bracket off of the armature assembly. The armature assembly is retained in that bracket, and then I have the pieces here. Now, normally your bracket, your field, and your brushes are not going to fail. If you do have a failure there, you just continue to take this assembly apart like our other motors and you're golden. On the Designer Series with this magnet disc, you're going to have to get that off. Now you can take a standard small gear puller, hook it up, place it in the socket, and work it off. It is a reusable part, and then when you press it back on, you want to get it. We'll try and get it here in this close-up. You've got to get these magnets as close to the bracket as you can without it rubbing at any point. Okay, that's basically the spacing. All right. So let's put it back together. It's very simple to reassemble. We'll take our field with our bracket. All of the washers have been retained inside the bracket. So the thrust washer, the tolerance washer, and you can see the ground ring up there. They're all still in there, so there's very little worry about those parts. So, and if you've seen our other repair videos, hopefully you have. If not, check them out, they're worth watching. I prefer to brace the brushes on top of the shaft of the armature, and then I'll work them back and forth over the commutator to reassemble. If you've pulled the brushes out, obviously you can just set it down and reinstall the brushes. So I'll just get that into position really fast. And again, you don't want to use anything too terribly sharp and potentially damage the brushes or the commutator. So I'm just at the last portion, just getting that last brush down over the commutator. And we can put our screws back in if they've fallen out. I like to leave them in because it's a little easier. Just run it down. All right, now if you're using an electric screwdriver, make sure your torque setting isn't too tight. You don't want to break or strip anything. Okay, now that I've got the motor screws back in, we can put the fan assembly back on. Fan, spacer, and then we take our fan. Now, the Designer Series uses the same fan as the ES3 family with the stamped L, and that should be facing up. We put our washer, and then we put our nut. And we just tighten that up. It is a nylock nut, so it will retain once you've got it tightened. It's not going to come off. And on this part, you just want to hand tighten. Okay. All right, so there's our motor assembly ready to go back into the unit. So let's go ahead and reassemble. We start with our top housing. Retrieve our board. Now this may be a bit of a challenge to see, but there's two little retaining pins here. And what you're going to do is put your board on and then actually just press. Okay, you won't hear a snap. There's nothing audible, but it just makes sure that it's in the right location. All right, now again, if you're using a power driver, keep your torque setting really low on these screws going into the plastic. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and put the motor back in. Now, you've got this slotted portion of the bearing bracket, which comes to the back of the assembly. All right, so don't forget, very important to have your magnet disc lined up with the post of the die cast bracket there. All right, so all we have to do is set it in there once it's lined up. Okay, it's not going to snap into place or anything like that. It just goes in. Take our 4 screws, we pop those in, and then we can tighten them down. Now when you're tightening these screws, there is not a pattern that it has to be done in. Just keep your torque setting on your screwdriver low so it doesn't strip the plastic. Okay, so here we go. All right, now the last step that we're going to do for the motor assembly, we're going to get our little bracing pad. We're going to take our sling ring that we popped off. We're just going to set it on top and very gently with the hammer, just tap it into position. Okay, flush. Now we can turn this back over and continue with the reconnection of all of our wires. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, these are non-polar. You can hook them up either way. So you have motor A over here, Just push them all the way on. Motor B over here. Bring your ground wire around. And connect that to any of the 3 earthing posts is fine. The top one is probably the easiest one to get to. We're just going to slide that all the way down. And finally our thermistor, bring that around, slide it on. Now with the motor connected, we can attach our power cord. You can do this without the middle housing at all. We connect our earth, and then we can connect the line and the neutral. Now all these posts are labeled, so you don't have to worry about, oh, is that the neutral post? It is labeled for neutral. Then we take our motor, our middle housing, put our power cord through it. Now you've got all these locating pins that you're going to want to hit for that assembly just to slide right on. Very simple. Take your 2 screws, retighten those, low torque. Don't strip out the plastic. Okay. With that done, we can take our rigid baffle that's going to slide over the same 4 locating posts that the middle housing did. Just going to put that in, and it should just snap down in there. Now this is why you have to have that flanged portion of the bearing bracket to the back. Okay, with this on, now we can put our cord restraint in. It just slides in. Push your wires down, just like so. Then we take our bottom housing. 4 screws go through the baffle into the housing, and then we just tighten them down. And that's all there is to the new Blendtec Designer Series repair. As always, if you have questions, feel free to contact us.